Caving is a thrilling adventure, but it can also turn into a nightmare in an instant. In this video, we're exploring some of the most devastating and tragic incidents in caving history. These stories are not just about the dangers of the caves themselves, but about how unpredictable and unforgiving nature can be. Lives were lost, dreams shattered, and what started as exploration turned into some of the darkest moments in human history. Stay until the end, because the final story will leave you speechless. William Floyd Collins came across Sand Cave in late December 1924. For him, this was a life-changing moment because the cave was situated near a highway, making it highly accessible to tourists. Sensing a business opportunity, Floyd quickly made a deal with the landowners to split the profits 50-50 from any future tours or exploration of the cave. Floyd wasted no time and immediately began working to open the cave, as it was still a narrow and dangerous passageway that few had dared to explore. This lack of a proper entrance deterred many potential tourists, but Floyd was determined. Over the next several weeks, Floyd dedicated hours each day to digging out rocks and widening the cave's entrance, trying to make it safer and more inviting for visitors. His goal was to turn the cave into a tourist attraction that would provide him with a steady income. After a few more days of intense work, Floyd was close to achieving his goal. On January 30th, 1925, he decided to venture into the cave again, unaware that this would be his final expedition. That day, the weather was cold and snowy as Floyd entered the cave with his trusty kerosene lantern. Having spent so much time working there, he had become accustomed to the cave's darkness and dampness. Navigating the tunnels posed no real issue for him anymore. He lowered himself through the first crevice, dropped to his knees, and began crawling forward. Eventually, he reached a point where most explorers turned back a narrow passage known as the squeeze. This opening was just 9 inches tall, a gap so tiny that even a child would have difficulty passing through it. For years, no one had dared to venture beyond this point, but Floyd, always fearless, decided to take on the challenge. He laid flat on the ground, pulling his body through the tiny space by pushing with his feet. The walls of the tunnel were lined with sharp gypsum crystals that scraped against his clothes and skin, making the journey painful and slow. However, Floyd persevered and eventually emerged on the other side. On the other side of the squeeze, the cave opened up slightly, giving Floyd a bit more room to maneuver. Ahead of him was a ledge that dropped into a narrow pit, which he had partially opened on previous trips by removing some rocks. This pit, however, was still very small, about the size of a chimney. Carefully, Floyd lowered himself feet first into the pit, mindful of the sharp rocks that surrounded him. As he descended, his excitement grew. He was getting closer to the large cavern that he had been working so hard to reach. This was the main section of the cave that Floyd believed could be a significant tourist attraction. When he finally reached the bottom of the pit, his emotions overcame him. He had done it. He had discovered the main section of Sand Cave. For a moment, Floyd stood there in awe, taking in the magnitude of what he had just accomplished. However, his joy was short-lived. As he admired the cave, he noticed that the flame of his lantern was flickering, a clear sign that it was about to go out. Not wanting to be left in total darkness, Floyd decided it was time to leave. He climbed back up the narrow pit with care, knowing how fragile the cave's structure was. When he reached the top of the descent, he pushed his lantern ahead of him, but as fate would have it, the lantern slipped from his hand, crashing to the ground and extinguishing the flame. Floyd was now in complete darkness, but he refused to panic. He knew the cave well enough to find his way back out, even without light. Slowly, he began pushing his way through the narrow opening, careful not to disturb any loose rocks. Unfortunately, as he maneuvered his body, his foot knocked a large rock out of place. The rock tumbled onto his left leg, trapping it in a small crevice. At first, Floyd thought he could free himself. Using his other leg, he tried to push the rock off, but the more he struggled, the more rocks fell on top of him. Soon, his hands, legs, and even his head were pinned beneath the debris. Trapped and immobilized, Floyd began to shout for help, but deep in the cave, no one could hear his cries. Hours passed with no rescue in sight. As night fell, Floyd remained stuck in the cave, his body growing colder and weaker by the minute. He could do nothing but hope and pray that someone would come looking for him. The next morning, 2 of the property owners, Ed Estes and Bill Doyle, arrived at the cave to check on Floyd's progress. With them was Doyle's 17-year-old son, Jewel. When they reached the cave entrance, they found Floyd's coat and hat but no sign of him. They called out his name but received no reply. Concerned, Jewel, who was slender enough to fit through the narrow passageways, ventured deeper into the cave. After a challenging crawl through the squeeze, he found Floyd, who was stuck beneath the rocks but still alive. Floyd was overjoyed to see Jewel and immediately asked him to fetch help. Jewel hurried back to the surface and alerted Floyd's family. Soon, Floyd's brother, Marshall, and their father, known as Pap, arrived at the cave, where a small crowd had already gathered. Word of Floyd's situation had begun to spread. Marshall and another man entered the cave, but like many others, they were unable to pass through the squeeze. Homer Collins, Floyd's other brother, was determined to save him. Guilt weighed heavily on Homer, as Floyd had invited him to explore the cave together that Friday morning, but Homer had declined. Now, he was desperate to make up for that decision. News of Floyd's predicament spread quickly, and soon, people from the surrounding area gathered at the cave entrance. He pushed his way through the crowd of nearly 100 people and entered the cave. Ignoring the pain from the sharp rocks cutting into his skin, Homer squeezed through the tunnel, finally reaching his brother. But Floyd's condition was worsening by the hour. The bonfires that people had started outside the cave were causing the ice to melt, sending more freezing water down into the cave. Floyd was wet, cold, and losing strength. Despite the conditions, Homer stayed with his brother for 8 hours, doing everything he could to comfort him. Floyd told Homer about the cave he had discovered and how he would never go back in once he was free. But as much as Homer wanted to save his brother, he was forced to leave the cave when exhaustion and injuries overtook him. When Homer emerged from the cave, he was furious to see that the crowd had grown even larger. Reporters had arrived, eager to document the rescue attempt, and they swarmed Homer with questions. Enraged, Homer told them to go see the situation for themselves. Later in the afternoon, more people attempted to reach Floyd. Some succeeded, while others couldn't navigate the treacherous cave passages. One man eventually emerged from the cave with grim news: Floyd was dead. Another came out shortly after and informed reporters that the pit had caved in, making it impossible to reach Floyd. Marshall, Floyd's brother, was devastated. Determined to confirm the truth for himself, he offered a staggering reward, a huge sum for that time, to anyone who could successfully enter the cave and provide an update on Floyd's condition. Despite the reward, each person who tried came out with the same unfavorable report: dead, not seen, caved in. As the evening drew near, Homer, Floyd's other brother, decided to go in once more to verify the news for himself. Heart pounding and fighting exhaustion, he pushed his way through the narrow tunnels and finally reached his brother. To his immense relief, Floyd was still alive. Floyd's voice was weak, but he was conscious and coherent. Homer felt a surge of hope and immediately set to work, carefully removing as many rocks as he could. For the next several hours, he toiled relentlessly, clearing debris and trying to free Floyd's body from the rocks that pinned him. By the 4th day of Floyd's entrapment, Homer managed to free his brother's hands, a small but significant victory. Floyd was grateful and asked Homer and the other rescuers to tie a rope around his chest so they could pull him out. It was a moment of hope, a possible breakthrough after days of despair. On Tuesday morning, Homer descended into the cave once more, this time carrying a harness designed to help pull Floyd out of the cave safely. With the harness in place and everything set, the men above began to pull. For the first few moments, they made some progress. Floyd's body shifted slightly, inching out of the narrow passage that had trapped him for so long. But then, just as they thought they might succeed, Floyd screamed in pain, "Stop. I can't stand it. It's going to pull me in too." The rescuers halted immediately. The pressure of the harness was too much for Floyd's weakened body, and it felt as if it might tear him apart. The attempt had to be abandoned, and once again, Homer was left with no choice. The crowd outside the cave swelled to over 1,000 people, turning the rescue effort into a public spectacle. Hotels in the area were booked solid, and prices for food and supplies skyrocketed as opportunistic vendors took advantage of the crowds. But inside the cave, things were getting worse. The sheer number of people moving in and around the cave entrance was destabilizing the rock formations. On February 4th, the worst happened: the entrance to the pit collapsed entirely, cutting off all access to Floyd. Although no one was injured in the collapse, it meant that Floyd was now completely unreachable. In a desperate attempt to save him, workers began digging a new shaft into the cave, hoping to reach Floyd before it was too late. For days, they labored tirelessly, but the effort was slow and dangerous. Inside the cave, Floyd was growing weaker by the hour, deprived of food and water and suffering from hypothermia. His body was slowly shutting down. By February 13th, the workers had nearly reached him, but their efforts came too late. On February 16th, 1925, Floyd Collins was found dead, still trapped in the cave where he had spent his final days. Floyd's death was a tragic end to a story that had captivated the nation. It all began on a crisp autumn morning. A group of 16 young boys and 3 teachers from the Methodist Children's Home in Berea set out on a field trip to the village of Showingbrunn in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. Excited for a day of outdoor exploration, the group was looking forward to an adventure among the hills and forests. However, their plans were soon derailed by an unexpected event: a flat tire. What had been planned as a routine outing quickly turned into an impromptu decision to seek out a nearby alternative destination. Quick thinking and flexibility led the group to the Hinckley Reservation, a well-known natural area home to the infamous Wildcat Cave, nestled within Whipp's Ledges. Though the destination had not been part of their original itinerary, the children were thrilled at the prospect of exploring a mysterious cave that held a certain allure among locals. For Maurice Bold in particular, the cave represented the perfect opportunity for adventure. The young boy had visited the cave on previous trips and was eager to show off his knowledge of the area to his friends. Wildcat Cave was no ordinary cave. While its entrance, a gaping 15-foot wide and 4-foot high mouth in a sandstone cliff, was easily accessible and well known among the community, the cave's interior was far less explored. In fact, the cave had never been officially mapped, and much of its underground passages remained shrouded in mystery. Over the years, rumors swirled about the cave's use as a hideout for criminals. As Maurice and his friends made their way to the cave's entrance, a palpable sense of excitement filled the air. Though they had visited Wildcat Cave on previous field trips, something about this particular day felt different. For Maurice in particular, the thrill of exploration had taken hold, and he was determined to lead his friends deeper into the cave than they had ever ventured before. The group's plan was simple. They would explore the main tunnel, a passage roughly 80 feet long which had been trodden by previous visitors. At the end of the tunnel, a large leaning rock marked the terminus of the passage, and beyond that, a sizable chamber was believed to exist. A chamber. With confidence born from previous trips, Maurice eagerly took the lead, guiding the group into the cave's yawning entrance. The main tunnel, at first, offered plenty of room for the children to maneuver, and for the first 60 feet, the group was able to walk comfortably. But as they ventured deeper into the cave, the passage began to narrow, the ceiling dropped lower, and the walls closed in, forcing the explorers to move in a crouching position. Upon reaching the junction where the leaning rock stood, Maurice faced a critical decision. The passage split into 3 different directions, and without proper lighting or experience, it was easy to confuse one route for another. Though his friends trusted his judgment, Maurice made a fateful choice. He followed a passage that led him into an increasingly narrow crevice. Believing that the large chamber was just beyond the next bend, Maurice pressed on, unaware that he was heading into a trap. What Maurice didn't realize at the time was that the passage he had chosen was not only narrowing but also sloping downwards. As he crawled further into the tunnel, the walls closed in, squeezing tighter around his body. With each inch he moved forward, the space became more confining, and soon he found himself wedged in a crack barely wide enough to accommodate his slim frame. His breathing became labored as the pressure from the surrounding rock began to constrict his chest. The darkness and the tight confines of the cave were suffocating, and Maurice quickly realized he was trapped. Meanwhile, his friends, unaware of the danger Maurice was in, continued exploring nearby. It wasn't until they heard his desperate cries for help echoing through the cave that they understood something had gone terribly wrong. Panicked, they rushed to find a teacher, who quickly squeezed into the cave to attempt a rescue. The teacher, armed with little more than a belt, tried to lasso Maurice's ankle in the hopes of pulling him free, but the effort was in vain. The belt snapped and Maurice was wedged even deeper into the crevice. Time was running out and Maurice's situation was becoming more dire by the minute. The pressure on his chest was making it increasingly difficult to breathe, and the cold, damp air of the cave was sapping his strength. Desperate for help, the teacher called for professional rescuers. The first to arrive on the scene was Fire Chief Paul Chodera, who immediately led a team of firefighters to Wildcat Cave. Equipped with a portable generator to provide light and oxygen, the rescuers assessed the situation and quickly realized they faced an enormous challenge. The narrowness of the cave's passages and the unpredictable topography made it nearly impossible for rescuers to reach Maurice. Even with specialized equipment, such as a pulley system with hooks, every attempt to free the boy was met with difficulty. The rescuers had to proceed with extreme caution, as any sudden movement could further injure Maurice or worsen his situation. Combining tactical skill and remarkable bravery, the rescuers explored various strategies to free Maurice from his dangerous predicament. Contractors suggested drilling through 36 feet of solid rock, but geologists warned of the risk of a cave-in. As the situation dragged on into the night, tension mounted among both the rescuers and the growing crowd of onlookers as temperatures dipped into the 30s. More than 200 emergency workers, spectators, family members and reporters gathered at the scene. One proposed idea came from Terry Brown, an experienced cave explorer from Akan. He suggested rigging a makeshift pulley system, using a metal ring spiked into the cave's ceiling instead of traditional hooks. However, the operation required precision and timing. If the rescuers applied too much force, they risked injuring Maurice further. Rescuers pulled and tugged, managing to move Maurice just a few inches, but the pulley gave way, pushing him back. The primary concern was keeping Maurice conscious. If he lost consciousness, there would be no way to get him out without his own effort. This situation is reminiscent of the Nutty Putty Cave tragedy, where the rescue attempt ended after John Jones passed out, as 20% of any cave rescue relies on the victim's ability to help themselves. Throughout the night, rescuers did their best to keep Maurice's spirits up. They asked him about his personal life, joked about treating him to a steak dinner, and made him count to 25 and back again. Many volunteers offered help, but few could get close enough to assist once they entered the cave. Hours passed, and the rescuers were no closer to freeing the boy. The weight of the task was starting to take its toll on the rescuers, who knew that any mistake could be fatal. In the hours that followed, the scene outside Wildcat Cave became a hub of activity. Emergency workers, journalists, and concerned citizens gathered as the news of the trapped boy spread across the country. Reporters delivered live broadcasts, and radio stations issued urgent appeals for help. Among those who answered the call was Evelyn Pinky Pettit, a petite nurse who had a reputation for bravery in tough situations. She arrived at the cave and spent hours comforting Morris, offering words of encouragement as the rescuers worked tirelessly to devise a new plan. As the hours ticked by, Morris's condition became increasingly critical. His voice, once strong, grew weaker, and his responses to the rescuers became more vague. It was clear that time was running out. The rescuers were left with one final chance to save the boy, and they knew they had to act quickly. In a last-ditch effort, the Air Force flew in a specialized rescue team from Washington, D.C. Among them was 15-year-old Eagle Scout Michael Rich, who volunteered to crawl into the tightest part of the cave to reach Morris. Michael was able to get closer to Morris than anyone else had. Following instructions, Michael used a glycerin solution on Morris's hips to make them slippery. He then slid a narrow support board under Morris's legs to reduce friction during the pull. At Michael's signal, the team began pulling. Although the old support slipped a few times, firm efforts from above eventually freed Morris. As Morris was lifted out of the cave, more than 24 hours after the ordeal began, the crowd erupted in cheers. The boy, though battered and bruised, had survived. Nutty Putty Cave, located near Utah Lake, is a naturally formed underground cave system stretching over 1,400 feet in length. Discovered in 1960, it quickly became a popular spot for spelunkers and adventure enthusiasts. The cave's name comes from the clay-like texture of its walls, which make it a unique but slippery and challenging environment to navigate. Known for its tight, claustrophobic passageways, it attracted both amateur and seasoned cavers alike, all eager to conquer its notorious squeezes like the aptly named Birth Canal and Scout Eater. Despite its popularity, Nutty Putty Cave had a reputation for being perilous. Many cavers had found themselves stuck in its narrow tunnels, but with time and effort, all had been rescued. That was until November 2009, when John Jones' experience would take a tragic turn, changing the cave's legacy forever. John Edward Jones was a 26-year-old medical student, husband, and father. Actually, John Jones was no stranger to caving. Growing up in a family that loved exploring caves, he had spent many childhood weekends venturing into the underground and an experienced caver who had explored several caves in Utah. John decided to visit Nutty Putty Cave on the evening of November 24, 2009, with his brother Josh. It was supposed to be a fun, adventurous outing just like many others he had enjoyed before. But this time, things would go terribly wrong. Remarkably, none of them had explored this cave before. They relied solely on a map and stories shared by others. Before diving into their underground adventure, it's crucial to note a few things. Nutty Putty Cave has only one entrance, about 1.8 meters wide, meaning you can't enter and exit through different points. Instead, explorers must navigate passages until they reach an opening or room, where they decide to turn around or continue. This makes it essential to follow well-explored paths to ensure there's enough space to turn back and avoid getting lost. Key areas in the cave include the Big Room, the Maze, and the Big Slide, which descends at a steep 45-degree angle but is spacious enough for safe navigation. Most cavers stop after the Big Slide, as the challenges intensify beyond this point. Here, a room branches into two paths: the well-mapped right path, known as Bob's Push or the Birth Canal, and the less explored left path. On the day of the incident, John, his brother Josh, and their friends decided to split into pairs and explore different cave sections. John, with his confident nature, chose to go with Josh towards Bob's Push. However, the main issue arose when they passed through the Big Slide room. It's believed John intended to go through the Birth Canal but mistakenly entered Ed's Push, a less explored and poorly documented passage due to its complexity. Despite the dangers, John continued, thinking he was on the right path. Ed's Push is a challenging 30-foot path with many twists and turns, requiring a special technique to maneuver through its narrow limestone tunnels. John eventually reached a dangerous area known as the Corkscrew. This area gained notoriety after a previous incident in 2004 involving a 16-year-old named Brock Clark. Unlike John Jones, Brock was smaller, standing at just 5 feet 7 inches and weighing 140 pounds, compared to John's 6 foot, 200-pound frame. Brock became stuck while trying to turn around in the tight corkscrew passage. He ended up wedged in an L-shaped position, and it took the rescue team a grueling 14 hours to finally free him. Despite the risks, John pushed on, believing he had achieved something few could. The passage widened briefly before leading to a ledge. John knew he couldn't turn back, so he continued forward, hoping to find a space wide enough to turn around. As he approached the ledge, he had to exhale all the air from his lungs to squeeze through a tight spot. Unfortunately, he found no opening and was pulled downward by gravity on the 45-degree slope. Exhausted and unable to turn around, John moved forward until he saw what looked like an opening, giving him hope. Thinking it was similar to the birth canal's end, he tried to squeeze through, only to find himself stuck. His torso was wedged in the narrow fissure, making it nearly impossible to move. As he tried to push himself up, he realized his arms were pinned in awkward positions, and his situation worsened. Relaxing his muscles only caused his body to slide deeper into the narrowest part of the hole, making it hard for him to breathe. Panicking, John called out to Josh for help.
Josh!
Josh crawled towards him, navigating the same obstacles John had. When he finally reached John, he was horrified by what he saw. Josh said he wrapped John's calves with his feet and tried to pull John out, but with no success. Despite their efforts, Josh couldn't pull John out. Exhausted and realizing the severity of the situation, they decided to call for professional help. After a quick prayer together, Josh promised to return as soon as possible. While Josh went for help, other family members and friends tried to come to John's location as close as possible to reach John to offer support. As time passed, gravity continued to pull John deeper into the crevice, and he began experiencing difficulty breathing due to the pressure on his diaphragm. Every second was a race against time. Susie Mater was the first rescuer to drop everything and rush to the cave. It took about 3 hours for her to arrive after Josh went to get help. Susie was familiar with the cave and the challenging corkscrew passage, so she tied a rope around her ankle as a safety measure. Being 5 feet 3 inches tall also made it easier for her to maneuver through the tight spaces more quickly than Josh. When Susie reached John around 12:30 in the morning, she found him surprisingly calm, confident that a professional would be able to help him. Susie noticed John had retrograde amnesia, likely from a fall that caused him to hit his head. She tied a rope around his feet and tried to pull him out of the fissure, but the rough passageway caused too much friction, reducing the rope's effectiveness. Despite trying various methods, she only managed to move John a few inches before he was pulled back again. Realizing this wasn't working, she decided that a more advanced solution was needed, specifically a pulley system, which had been used successfully in a similar rescue in 2004. As more rescuers arrived, they discussed their options. The journey to John, who was 400 feet from the cave entrance, took over an hour for each rescuer. The corkscrew passage made transporting large equipment nearly impossible, and the hard stone of the cave walls made it difficult to install hooks for the pulley system. While the pulley system was being set up, other team members spoke to John to keep him calm. By this time, John had been upside down for several hours, which started to take a severe toll on his body. The human body is not designed to remain in such a position for long periods. Blood began pooling in his brain, his organs pressed against his lungs, and his ability to breathe became compromised. Prolonged pressure on the brain can lead to hallucinations and memory loss, both of which John began experiencing. The rescuers, exhausted but determined, rotated shifts to preserve their energy. Some even got temporarily stuck in the corkscrew passage, causing further delays. Unlike John, they were secured by ropes and could eventually free themselves. Unfortunately, John didn't have the same security and struggled to breathe in the confined space. The team then decided to use a wired telecom system to allow John to speak with his wife, Emily. She encouraged him to rest and assured him they were doing everything they could to get him out. By 4 p.m., the pulley system was ready. A team of 8 rescuers worked together to try to pull John out. Ryan Schertz, one of the rescuers closest to John, attempted to help by pushing his legs. As they pulled, John screamed in pain. His legs were completely numb and blood flow had been cut off, leading to nerve damage. They paused every few minutes to let John rest, slowly making progress inch by inch. Suddenly, the situation worsened. The narrow passage, just 12 inches high, prevented John's feet from moving freely. After spending 19 hours upside down, John couldn't bend his legs to facilitate the rescue. The rescuers considered breaking his legs, but the on-site doctors warned that it could lead to shock and possibly cardiac arrest. Ryan tried to bend John's legs, but a sudden loud snap occurred. A carabiner failed, striking Ryan in the face and causing him to pass out briefly. When he regained consciousness, he saw blood everywhere. John had wedged himself deeper into the crevice. Ryan, injured, had to be taken out for medical attention. His father, Dave, took over but realized that pulling John out without him being able to push would be impossible. After several failed attempts, Dave switched with Brandon Koalis, who brought the telecom system back to let John speak with Emily again. John, now unresponsive, made gurgling sounds, suggesting he might be suffocating. At 11:56 p.m. on November 25th, John was pronounced dead. The rescuers had worked tirelessly for over 24 hours trying to save him, but the effort proved futile. John had endured an incredible 27 hours in an upside-down position, which far exceeded the usual survival time for such a predicament. His body quickly stiffened, making recovery impossible. Officials decided to seal off the Nutty Putty Cave, leaving John to rest there permanently. The cave was ultimately closed to the public, and John's body remains inside, a somber reminder of the dangers of caving. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more related videos.